Hi, welcome to the NYU Game Center lecture series. I'm Frank Lance. I'm the director of the Game Center, and really excited to have Jon Peterson here tonight. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors who help make the lecture series possible. The fine people at Arcadium, Avalanche, Fresh Planet, Gigantic Mechanic, and We Play Dots. Thank you very much for those people keeping game design alive in New York City. So yeah, I'm very excited for Jon's talk tonight. Jon is an author and a researcher who studies war games and strategy games and role-playing games, and is the author of this book, which came out a few years ago, called Playing at the World, which is a history of Dungeons and Dragons. And I am not a big fan of hyperbole, but I'm going to say that maybe the greatest single book on the topic of one game, okay, a deep dive into one game that I've ever read. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is really one of the most important books on games that I've ever read. It's a really important topic. It's an incredibly thorough and well-written book. And I found it fascinating and informative and kind of mind-blowing. And so I really recommend all of you, if you haven't yet, you can check this out. I think there's something, I mean, it's not only a fantastic demonstration of a mode of scholarship that I think we need more of in games, which is a deep and very thoroughly researched historical overview. But it is also, it takes as its topic a game that I think is even more important and influential than is understood, right? So, you know, I mean, it wasn't until we started really putting together the lectures for we have a sort of a survey class in the history of games called Games 101. And in putting together those lectures and looking at Dungeons and Dragons, and then seeing this theme that kind of unraveled through the entire history of games and video games, of the tension between the systems and the stories, between the sort of abstract structure and the layers of simulation and representation. We realized that you know, not only did Dungeons and Dragons invent so many of the classic kind of structural elements that we just take for granted. They're almost transparent to us. Things like, you know, things in combat, like hit points and damage, things like leveling up and things like loot and all of this stuff. But it's also this tension that Dungeons and Dragons kind of first embodied between these two things is kind of the tension that defines video games themselves. So I'm really excited that that's the topic that Jon is going to speak on tonight, not just talking about his book and Dungeons and Dragons, but the new work that he's doing in studying the influence of games, Dungeons and Dragons and games like it, on the history of digital games and computer games. So please join me in welcoming Jon Peterson.
Well, that's not too much to live up to. And you know, for my money, H.D.R. Murray's History of Chess, I think he may give me a run for my money. A great book about a great game, one of my many models for playing in the world. So yeah, I'm Jon, and I'm going to talk a bit today, not about, as Frank said, the traditional, that's exactly when we made that happen. He's going to sit down, this would turn off, come back. Not about kind of my traditional rah-rah Dungeons and Dragons, wow, what a fantastic game. I'm going to tell you all about Gygax and Artisan and how they came together and really what made the secret sauce of D&D. It's really better come back here in a minute.
There we go.
Yay. The HDMI cable is like right under my feet. What I might do is just leave this there. Hopefully that will alleviate that. But instead talk about something, again, that I'm not sure I've got completely figured out yet, but I've got enough of it figured out. I think it's probably worth sharing. We'll see how it goes. I think it might be some interesting stuff. Yes, this is, going to work, right? Okay, good. What I always put, this is a slide I've given in tons and tons of talks, and this very much recapitulates what you just heard. When we ask ourselves how D&D influenced computer games, obviously any game that tracks quantified health in some form, anything with a health bar, even Street Fighter and things like that, borrows from this concept of hit points. Now, D&D didn't quite invent the idea that you could quantify the amount of damage that a particular unit could withstand in a game, but it popularized it. It made it something that people really understood outside of a very tight and insular wargaming community. And you'll see this kind of across the board in all these categories. Any game where you've got a character, especially one who levels up with experience. This is something that every early reviewer of Dungeons & Dragons cites as being one of the most disruptive things about it. You keep the same character as you come back and play at different sections, at different times, you get better. It's what fed your addiction. Many people compared it to heroin early on, and that experience mechanic, which now underlies all the gamification that is built into so much of our society, is one of its most signature popularizations. Anything where you explore a world, anything where there's secret information that in D&D is behind the dungeon master's screen. He's got the dungeon, and you don't know what it is, you're trying to figure it out. You never know it's behind the next door. Anything that has that property. And any game really where you tell a story. When they sat down and made D&Ds, the authors were specifically trying to create a game that let you replay what you read about in fantasy fiction. The authors, they loved reading. They knew that people loved reading those things. They loved reading them so much, they wanted more. They wanted to be able to experience this, not just read about it. They wanted to be involved. They wanted to be in it. And at the time D&D came out, there was just nothing like it that offered that experience. So we can fairly ask, what don't computer games owe to D&D? Well, but let's take a step back, because there's a sense in which that has to be trivially false, right? If you look at a timeline, when D&D came out in 1974, it was after the magic year of 1972. In 72, you saw Computer Space. Okay, if you were really hip, you might have seen Computer Space in October of 1971 even. The Magnavox Odyssey was out in 72, and of course that is designed from 66 to 68 originally. Pong was out in 72. So there were a lot of things that we think of as being original contributions to computer game culture that obviously just predated D&D. And if you look at a 1978 game like Space Invaders, here you've really gone away from the discrete components of the video games, the earlier systems, and have gone to largely computer hardware. I mean, did D&D really add anything to Space Invaders? You kind of take Computer Space and Breakout, Breakout, that game where you turn Pong on its side and there's bricks on the top and you shoot them with your little ball. You kind of figure out how you combine that with Computer Space and you've got Space Invaders, right? And it's like one of the simplest mashups that you can see in the history of computer games. You got to be careful in saying exactly how much influence D&D had against that arcade tradition as it emerged. But I think to really get that, you gotta wind back the clock. To understand the chains of influence, you need to look more at kind of how tabletop gaming and the culture that created D&D came about. And D&D came out of this long collaborative tradition of fandom. And fandom is something now I fear we have to look at with a bit of historical reserve. There was fandom as it was in the 20th century. It's a little bit different, actually, from what we have after the internet. The internet has just fundamentally transformed the ways that communities organize around cultural products and promote them and are engaged with them. Back in the 20th century, and the prototype for this, of course, was science fiction fandom in the 1930s. People created clubs. They had small, local clubs typically. There were clubs like the Futurians here I'm thinking about, which are largely East Coast, New York kind of club that many of the seminal science fiction authors were members of. They would meet periodically. They would produce amateur publications, these zines that they would share with one another to kind of give news or ideas. They would hold conventions. These were not well-attended conventions originally in science fiction fandom, but you might have 10, 20, 30 people showing up for these things in the 30s and 40s. And finally, they made amateur products. They produced zines that actually contributed to the literature of science fiction. And many very prominent science fiction authors began in that culture and then moved out into the mainstream. Once that blueprint for how you do a fandom had been generated, well, games fandom pretty much took that over in the 1950s when it began. created the same kinds of structures, the same clubs, the same zines, the same conventions, amateur products, and so on. And computer fandom even would have many of the same properties when it came about. So we kind of need to look back a bit at science fiction fandom and earlier games fandom to really understand what happened with computers when they came out and how that impacted it. So if we look at a longer timeline than the last one I showed, and just say the 70s are the 70s, and here's the things that came before that, we can see a tradition of science fiction games and simulations that led up to that. And this tradition is where many of those principles of simulation that we're so engaged with, so many of the things that fans didn't just want to read about, they wanted to experience, came out from. And we can see a very prominent computer game in the middle of that, Spacewar. I'll be talking about Spacewar a bit tonight, actually. One game that I'm really fascinated with these days is the game you see on the far left, a game called Interplanetary, which came out in 1943. It was played at the World Science Fiction Convention that year, which was attended again by 15 or 20 people in Boston. But it's really one of the first attempts to gamify science fiction. And it became profoundly influential, actually. It went through a bit of a revival in 1958 in Boston, in Seattle, and in Los Angeles, right around the time, suspiciously, that people might have started working on things in Spacewar. I'll have a bit more to say about how science fiction fandom may have interfaced with that community. But when we talk about these principles of simulation, I mean, it just goes all the way back. And this is stuff that I do cover in some detail in my book, Playing at the World. You know, one of the things that motivated me to start writing Playing at the World was when I was at the British Museum. I saw one of those first century AD Roman 20-sided dice, right? And we've all seen these online since. And you kind of ask yourself, how far back really does everything go, right? I mean, who is the first person that sat down and said, okay, I've got a die, and you know, if I roll a 6 on this, then if I've got a sword and you've got a shield, it turns out I hit you. And use that implement of chance to decide a fictional event. And for me, this is part of the definition of simulation that is built into the account that I put together in Playing at the World. I see that as a fundamental breakthrough in intellectual history. And it came from the Rice-Fitz family in 1824, a time when statistics and probability were still relatively young sciences, and getting that kind of chocolate and butter together to make it a game, simulation, combat, that was really an extraordinary and unprecedented innovation. And this has gone on to feature in all kinds of the war games, like the Tactics, which appeared on the previous slide there in 1954. Not a science fiction game. That would be the first Avalon Hill board war game that began our board wargaming tradition in the United States. But you know, the fascinating thing about these models people made of combat, when people sat down and looked at how you could quantify combat, how you could simulate combat and decide fictional events, is that as time went on and weapons changed and tactics and strategy changed, those mathematics became necessary to actually wage war. And this is something that's really remarkable. You know, the classic example you can cite of this that's pretty straightforward is the Battle of Jutland in 1916 between the Germans and the English off the coast of Denmark. This was a time when, you know, the cordite and steel, the technology of the gun rights had enabled a ship to be able to shoot 9 nautical miles away. And 9 nautical miles away is something where ordinary targeting, like line of sight targeting, simply doesn't work anymore. Your ship is steaming at 25 knots, their ship is steaming at 25 knots, you're shooting from a moving target at a moving target. Where the battle actually takes place then is in the map. It takes place down in the bowels of the ship, where people are using rangefinders, where people are projecting what the position of ships will be relative to them, using extremely complex calculations. And the origins of computing overall lie so much in the innovations that came out there in the First World War as people tried and largely failed to grapple with this problem. By the Second World War was all easy. By the Second World War, you basically had analog computers. You just plug them into your guns. You plug a radar thing into that. It would figure it all out for you. And that literally was the origins of computers as we understand them. But to look at how those mathematical models gave rise to both the game and the tactics of war themselves has led me to start thinking about a lot of these games that we see in the 19th century and even the early 20th century, like they're computed games. There weren't computers yet, like you couldn't have the computer do the work for you, but you had to do computing to actually execute the system of the game based on the complexity of the model. So I started calling those computed games. And people went to a lot of trouble, actually, to try to facilitate the computations that were required for computed games. This is an example from Livermore, the American Game Strategy from 1881. This is, I'll actually stand up a bit to help explain this, because it requires a little bit of explanation. So this entire firing board helped the person who ran the simulation to determine the results of combat. All the section of the tallies of losses here were used to ascertain basically how many hit points of damage various units had taken as combat went on. The fascinating part of it, though, is this computing table here, which is a logarithm-based table that you use to calculate the losses that would be sustained from fire based on all kinds of modifiers that might apply. So if you're shooting at a group of troops with your group of troops, well, if that group of troops is crouching down, then there will be a positive modifier for them. But if your guns are better, there will be a positive modifier for you. And if it's raining out, that'll be a negative modifier for you. And these games, trying to strive for a level of realism, implemented such a level of complexity, you actually required a table like this just to keep track of the math as you resolved a single shot in combat. You might put little pegs in these, and you get instructions like, okay, for this you move this forward 3 if that happens, you move it back 6 if that happens. You might have to make 12 or 15 of those moves to resolve a single shot. But without something like this, you're doing it all in scratch paper, it's extremely error prone. This gives you a sense of how the computed game got to a point where really you needed something like computers for it to work, or you were just going to go crazy. I mean, it took so long to execute it, even with aids like this. But still, I find these kinds of aids endlessly fascinating. Now, of course, other people thought they could have more fun without doing a lot of computation. At around the time that you can see these gentlemen on the right brooding there over some Prussian war game, meditating deeply over this cerebral experience. What we have there on the left is one of the early bagatelle tables, one of the precursors to pinball. And we kind of see this contrast, I guess, between kinetic games where you let nature do your calculating for you. Rather than having to crunch the numbers on paper yourself, you make a game where its actual physical construction executes the calculations that need to be performed to make something interesting. Now, these are very different games at this point, but I'll be showing you some games that are actually trying to do the same effect using, in one case, the kinetic approach, and in the other case, the computed approach. There were some early attempts to reconcile this. There's a guy named H.G. Wells, a very famous science fiction author, less well known that he created a seminal war game. It was called Little Wars, that came out in 1913. And Little Wars was based on the idea of trying to take some of the principles that you see in those Prussian, very serious war games where you've got troop counters and so on, but instead to play it all out with toy soldiers. And in fact, to manage whether those toy soldiers get shot or not with little toy cannons that you aim at them and you shoot them. And to kind of try to reconcile that kinetic approach with something that is a bit more, still retains some strategic depth, but is more fun, easier to resolve, more playable. Always the tension we see in this between realism and playability. When you look at that massive board here, this assures a level of realism. If you're a serious military scientist, you're not just playing this stuff for child's play. You're doing this because it's a serious military simulation. You can show your work and how complicated this is, and how important it is. You might have less of an argument for that if you're lying down here, lining up your troops, and shooting at each other with little toy cannons. But nonetheless, it's really Little Wars that first created, I'd say, our hobby gaming culture. Now, that was a check that ended up in the mail to us for some time because it came out in 1913. And although Wells was a pacifist and really hoped that Little Wars would show people the futility of engaging in a great war, there kind of was a great war that immediately followed that. And a lot of the people he might have wanted to sell his game to never came back to England. Between the world wars, there was only kind of limited interest in this. But after the war, we begin to see this incredible boom in these simulation games, both military simulation games and other kinds as well. Here we see somebody who's really trying to do the same thing in two different ways. There were a bunch of these kinetic games, these electromechanical arcade machines that played baseball. They had a lot in common with pinball machines in some respect. There's like a little pinball that rolls down and you hit it with a bat. And depending on how you hit the bat, you can see there's kind of an upper deck to it. You'll actually see men end up on base and then go around. I'm totally fascinated by these electromechanical games, by the way. In California and San Francisco, we have this thing called the Musée Mécanique, which is the place where you can actually play a lot of these games still. They've refitted them so they use like modern quarter. Is there something like that in New York where you have like a place you can go and like play? I know there's one in England and Brighton as well. The one in San Francisco is absolutely phenomenal, though. If you're there, definitely check it out. The picture of that and the next one I'm going to show you both came from there. You see, again, across pretty much any genre, any category, you'll find people who want to do a racing game by figuring out how to compute it. This game on the right there is called Le Mans. It's an Avalon Hill game. Actually, it was based on an earlier game called Grand Prix that came out in 1954 that Avalon Hill acquired and rebranded this way. But it's very much based on, okay, this car has these statistics, and I'm going to roll to figure out what happens if it is better than this car in this particular stretch or not, and compute everything, track everything on paper. And then next to that, you've got, well, a game where you just ride your car, and there's a little rolling drum that goes by. This is a vertical scroller. If you ever played Spy Hunter, you used to do Spy Hunter with a cylinder. That would be this vertical scroller. The degree to which you can find an antecedent, by the way, for any of the early games in a mechanical instantiation is something somebody needs to write a book about. It probably won't be me. I'm not. There are people who actually know more about this than I do. I will allude to it in some things that I'm working on now, but there is a vast untapped potential, I think, for study of how much the arcade really owed to these electromechanical incarnations. So, I mean, given the tension between the kinetic and the computed, I'll do a little quiz time. In 1962, there was a very novel game that was really known and accessible only to a small community of dedicated hobbyists then. It was played with 2 ships. Each ship was controlled by a player. They maneuvered around this flat, 2-dimensional board. And as a controller of one ship, you would try to torpedo the other ship. You only had a limited number of torpedoes. And if you end up hitting, then you win. Does anybody here know what game I'm talking about?
Spacewar. Harpoon?
Spacewar is a very good guess. It's probably the right answer, actually, Spacewar. But I wasn't talking about U-Boat, an Avalon Hill game that came out in 1959 that had all these properties. Again, a bit of a joke, but in part just to point out, Spacewar had key precedents and influences. The idea that you would have a board like this and a duel between 2 ships. I can show you a game from 1880 that has this property. It's literally called The Duel. That was created in England, where very much like the pictures I showed earlier of the ships figuring out how to shoot each other in these cases, they use these mathematical models to generate these games. And U-Boat is always a fun one to bring up when I talk about Spacewar. And a game, by the way, that was very well known at MIT at the time. But yeah, Spacewar is the right answer to the question that I just raised. U-Boat is the snarky answer. It is fascinating because it's playable but highly computed. I mean, this I think really finally got the threads Wells was trying to get together. It's a game where you're using computation to ascertain movement, to track how torpedoes work, to track the gravitational force, and so on. And at the same time, nobody has to do the work except the computer. Right? It's just for free. And Spacewar really brought that together in a way that makes it deserve all of the acclaim that we can possibly heap on it. Much ink has been spilled about Spacewar. One hesitates to spill more ink about it, given how much there has been. However, there are parts of this story I'm not sure, the traditional narrative, that I'm not sure I quite buy. Steve Levy's famous book Hacker talks a lot about Timur, the tech model railroad club at MIT, and the huge railroad installations they made, and how that certainly was the only technical inspiration for Spacewar. I believe Sci-Fi Fandom was very organized at MIT at the time. You can find the names of the people who created Spacewar in those zines, and you'll find that they knew about a tradition of science fiction gaming, that it existed before Spacewar. And finally, there was a board game version of Spacewar at MIT in the 1960s. I don't believe that this is really known at the moment. I'll be writing more about that later. But I mean, the key point I make here is that science fiction computer games, they evolved in parallel in the 1960s. Many gamers did lack access to computers, but it was this community of people who were fascinated by science fiction. And when I say science fiction fandom, do understand it was inclusive of fantasy fandom, especially by 1965. people called themselves science fiction fans, even if they were really into what we would consider to be in that separate genre of fantasy today. And the people who made those sci-fi games in the mid-60s are the people who went on to create D&D in a crucial way. Gary Gygax worked in this game called the War of the Empires. One of the earliest, actually, the kind of 4X games, the expand, exploit, explore, expand, exploit, exterminate style of games that Civilization and its computer applications have popularized. And there were a vast number of them that came at that time, and a number of people who worked on computer adaptations of them of various kinds in the 1960s. Those people, too, were keen observers of early computer games. If you were into science fiction fandom and into war games at the time, you probably were in high school or in college. If you're in college, you were going to encounter things like Spacewar. You were going to understand the variants of Spacewar that were being played in different places. You're going to write about it. There is a huge untapped literature of this. And because I've spent so much of my research just in accumulation of fanzines that are sailing into this, one of the things that's made me interested in this as a project is that I just keep finding more and more of this, more and more encounters of people with games that are now completely forgotten. Some of which I think are really fascinating, but are written about by multiple sources who witnessed them all at a convention, who played this, and who wrote down what happened. And I don't think people who studied the history of computer games have really adequately mined that literature to try to figure out what parts of the story that fills in. So that's something I'm really profoundly interested in. And in particular, the Minneapolis crew who designed Minneapolis Spacewar, famously in July of 1971, in Analog, there was a write-up of the Spacewar variant that was being played at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And the people who did that went on to do this thing called Minneapolis Dungeon. It's literally the same set of people who, when D&D came out, were building variants of it. The communities are just completely continuous. And there are all kinds of interesting linkages to draw, especially between the Twin Cities crowd that worked on D&D and computer gaming. Another kind of unsung hero in this is Flying Buffalo. The Flying Buffalo company really fascinates me. Rick Loomis, as early as 1967, was proposing commercial computer war games. And his Flying Buffalo Computer War Games company, founded circa 1970, tried to give people an experience of playing a computer game before you could really realistically have a computer. And he did this largely as a play-by-mail thing. The computer merely moderated the game. You would send in results on a form to the computer would process everyone's orders and then send you back, well, here's what happened to you this turn. Though you can find some instances, actually, especially in Arizona where they were based, where they did this like in real time. They had a Raytheon 704, you would go sit there and you'd be able to interact with it in real time. These things are extremely rare, extremely precedent-breaking when you look at how people commercially interacted with computers and games at the time. But of course, by the time we're talking about Flying Buffalo, now we're in the realm when D&D really was in play, where Arneson was working with Chainmail in 1971. This is obviously a famous map of Arneson's town of Blackmore that he drew that appeared in Domesday Book number 13. And really it was, you have to think about it like D&D was taking shape in 72. There were draft forms of D&D that were relatively playable at the same time that Pong and computer space and so on were beginning to manifest. And doing those timelines very strictly against each other turns out to be informative as well. So D&D, of course, didn't get actually famous until 1979. There was this kid, a famous kid, who was supposed to be lost in the steam tunnels. It turned out he wasn't, but it created this myth that if you play D&D, it'll drive you crazy, and you'll have no idea what's going on. You'll quest after imaginary monsters. It's warping fragilely on minds. It's a cult. It's everything else. That hysteria didn't really begin until the summer of 1979. But D&D already had dominated the fandoms. The Venn diagram that I showed earlier. Science fiction fandom was completely captured by D&D by the end of 1975. You couldn't look in fanzines, in the APAs, the Amateur Press Association zines, for any of the major cities without seeing just deluge of D&D related traffic in it. Of course, Alarms and Excursions, which attempted to try to siphon some of that off to make LA less dominated by it, began pretty early then, around June of 1975. And computer fandom around the same time. We began to see the first computer adaptations we can prove existed. There's a lot of talk about well, I designed a D&D adaptation in 1973. I read that a lot. That I'm not sure I particularly credit. By 1975, though, it is clear that there were D&D adaptations that were interesting. And even folks like Flying Buffalo, again, they were just trying to run their computer war games company, basically pivoted in the face of this. If you were, studying the intersection of computers and games, it's likely you were going to turn to doing something related to fantasy roleplay immediately. And they did all kinds of fantastically innovative things to try to get computers and D&D to work together in the mid-70s. One example I like is their famous computer-generated dungeons, where every copy of this dungeon they sold was unique because a computer literally generated a different dungeon for every copy they sold. This is trying to get around the problem that, well, you sell the dungeon, and everybody, if they've already read it, if they already bought it, then they'll know how to beat it or whatever. So, okay, just have a different computer-generated dungeon for every copy of this we sell. They did a lot of kind of strange early hybrids like that. And I argue D&D played a big role in collapsing the fandoms into what I guess we now call geek culture. There's this one fandom to rule them all. You kind of expect if you meet somebody who's like into computers and they're into games, and probably they're into like sci-fi games, and they like Gravity or like the Avengers or something. There's just this overlap now that people deem geek culture. But before Star Wars, before the Apple II, before D&D, none of that would be a safe assumption that there was that much overlap between these communities. And D&D's capture kind of ended up binding a lot of this together, I think, at that time. And one of the key enablers really was the fact that we started to have open computer systems then. We can talk about the storied PP1 at MIT in 1962 and the things people did with it. There were bastions of openness. Dartmouth would be another great example, the DTSS system, which is where BASIC was invented, where people really first started to think about how to let ordinary people program a computer and make the kinds of things they wanted to make. This was just such a revolutionary idea that the people who designed BASIC and who built systems like DTSS were trading on. The Plato system is one of the archetypal examples of this, based at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. This is a mainframe system with many remote terminals like Cornell, and military installations, many other places. They had a very simple programming language. Actually wasn't designed by computer scientists, but the biologist was actually one of the main people who designed it, called Tutor. And as far as I can tell, the earliest graphical computer game was on that system. I'm not aware of any earlier precedent that the unnamed version that is discussed in Empire number 21 in a fanzine that a Cornell student wrote up his experiences. Screenshots from this era are incredibly rare. A lot of people have found kind of later versions of these games, games were made in 1980, and say, oh, here's a screenshot of this because it's some iteration that's so distinct from what it was. This is a game called Wizard with 2 Z's that was in fact around in 1976 and looked like this in 1976. Certainly a lot of people as well learned how to make their games into narratives from D&D, and that, as I said earlier, had this profound impact on the evolution of computer games. The Mirkwood Tales is perhaps one of the most seminal games that helped that happen. This was a game designed by this guy, Eric S. Roberts, who's now a professor at Stanford, a computer science professor. That was just a simple D&D variant that was really, really steeped in Tolkien. And it was designed to let you tell Tolkien-like games, very dialogic games. And famously, 2 of his players, one was Willie Crowther, who designed Adventure originally. Another was Dave Lebling, who was one of the protagonists behind Sword. And the Mirkwood Tales structure seems to have been, I think, the primary system influence on both of those games. If you go through the book that this is the cover of, you'll see all kinds of just amazing dialogic examples that look like they could have just been taken from the page of interactive fiction. And the fruits of hobbyism are you've got an Apple II and you've got BASIC, and you're a hobbyist and you're determined to tell the story you want to tell, you can make a Calabash. The young fan who made Calabash, who went by the name Lord British, ended up then doing Ultima as a successor to it. And this followed that long tradition of amateur productions in science fiction fandom and games fandom that just show how much all of this converged around those principles, and principles that D&D probably taught these games people for the first time. Because D&D had this just incredible invitation to collaborate. Famously, the last of the 3 D&D books ends with a statement saying, "Don't let us do any more of your imagining for you. Right? Go do it yourself. Come up with something." Which turned out to be a bit of a double-edged sword, actually. Can't gloss over that for today's talk. It also fascinates me how much the early PC game industry, the industry that worked on these open architectures, suppose the arcade closed architecture, again, the closed architecture, even in the VCS, like the original Atari entertainment system, but especially the cabinets, not to point to these amazing cabinets you have here, but the vilified cabinets of old. There really wasn't much way for a hobbyist to take them over back then. Now, of course, we've got MAME and things, we can do whatever we want with these cabinets today, but it was really the PC game industry that unleashed that profound creativity. And when you look at the foundation of the earliest game companies, people like Automated Simulations, who later became Epics, their founders met playing D&D in Palo Alto. One of them advertised in the Dragon, I'm a D&D looking for players, and this guy named John Freeman answered his ad, joined his campaign. They founded Automated Simulations. Avalon Hill, who made so many of those board games, those board war games, they founded Microcomputer Games, created so many titles, many of which written by people actually in Dave Arneson, one of the co-creators of D&D, Dave Arneson's immediate circle. People like Dave Wesley, Ross Maker, even Arneson himself had design credits in a lot of these games. Obviously, Infocom and companies like that came out of the story tradition I was just discussing, and there was just this tremendous mobility between people who designed for the tabletop and people who designed for this new computer environment. Famously, a lot of people went over to Coleco, for example, who had been key designers in the tabletop space. So that brings me pretty close to the end here. In short, it is hard to overstate D&D's influence on the system and content of games. I mean, I don't want to detract for a moment from the fact that you can't look at a Skyrim or a Dragon Age or a Diablo or a WoW or a take your pick without just seeing how little they stray from the fundamental models that the D&D set forth. I mean, Diablo could be a 1975 D&D campaign. It's perfect for that. They call it the year of the gilded hole, right? Where there's a hole in the ground, there's gold in it for some reason. You go down there, you get the gold out, and you bring it back to town. And that's the game. That's pretty much what Diablo is. Not to harsh on Diablo. But the apple just doesn't fall far from that particular tree. But it's important to understand that D&D is just one element in this larger tabletop legacy that goes back to the early 19th century. And it was really just when those simulations that were created to manage warfare then got so mixed up with the actual practice of warfare and helped with computing that everything got so intermingled, and you end up having so much difficulty figuring out how to separate the strands. And it's handy because it lets us see the chains of influence pretty clearly and to point out to where all this came from. And I think this broader context better shows how all that legacy ended up shaping computer games. And that's what I have to say today.
Fantastic. We'll wheel your or carry your little stool over, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and we'll open it up to the crowd for Q&A. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
And the thing so first of all, I want to ask you a little bit about your background and how you got into scholarship. And you're not an academic, right?
No.
But how did you end up writing, one of the sort of most scholarly and well-researched books on games ever?
I mean, honestly, a lot of academics I talked to expressed jealousy to me that I could do what I did in the sense of write a book that was really a factual narrative, that was just trying to get to the facts without having to make any overarching theoretical argument. And in some respects, it's actually, I think, somewhat liberating to be able to approach this really as an archival task. And playing at the world is largely an archival task. It was about processing more than 10,000 primary sources and figuring out what story I could pick out from them. So, I mean, the short answer is I began as a collector. I began as someone who, around 2000 or so, got serious about trying to buy up some of this stuff just because I like games and I wanted to, I bought my first printing of D&D, right, at that time, around 2000. And then over time, accumulated more and more. I had my, as I think I said already in the talk, I kind of had my moment in 2005 in the British Museum where I'd been playing a lot of World of Warcraft actually at the time. This was right after WoW had come out, where I just suddenly wanted to know where all this came from. I looked into it a bit. I read some of the existing literature on the subject, and I quickly became persuaded there were kind of two styles of narrative that were out there. There were people who really wanted to tell this story but lacked the resources to be able to do so. And then people who had the resources but seemed kind of reticent about processing them. They were more collectors, right? And I felt like I could close that gap and that it needed to be closed. And I never imagined I'd end up with a 700-page, 420,000-word book when I started on this. And I had many wiser plans than this along the way. But this is what I ended up with.
And you mentioned Murray's history of chess,
yes,
as an important influence. Was there anything else that was an influence on you?
Sure. One I always say that people really blink at me when I say is Gershom Scholem's history work. He's a guy who wrote actually about the history of Judaism. Okay. But he did this very much. So he's trying to solve problems about Kabbalah, right? We all know about Kabbalah. We all know that there's a very popular notion of Kabbalah that's out there in the world.
Is Madonna here? I don't know if she's here. She sometimes comes to these things.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There's a popular notion of it, and there's Aleister Crowley and people like that, right, who write about it, who are pseudo-scholars, right? Yeah. And then, well, there must be some kernel of truth behind this. And Gershom Scholem decided, okay, there are probably documents that tell this story. And if you just go find them, you'll be able to figure out what actually happened. And I think his methods actually tremendously informed what I did. He was actually, for those that follow critical theory stuff, he and Walter Benjamin worked together very closely on a lot of stuff. And so he's just an interesting character all around. Yeah.
Well, it's an approach that as I mentioned, I just think that is so welcome and kind of underrepresented in game scholarship, just this very close and detailed historical study of influence and people and times and history. I guess, so one of the threads that's so important in Dungeons & Dragons that you elucidate and that you talk about here, it's exactly the topic you're talking about, is this collision between these kind of two ways of thinking about the world, right? I always think of Dungeons & Dragons as being so unlikely because it is this combination of things that should not go together. On the one hand, kind of grognardian, detailed, mathematical wargaming, tabletop wargaming, this history, and on the other hand, improvisational theater, right? You would never think that these things would exist together, and yet they do. They're sort of like, there's this balance between these two ways of acting and thinking and looking at the world, and that I think ended up not just being successful, but being extraordinarily successful and influential. And I guess one question is, as a historian, was this bound to happen? Was it accidental? Was there some important confluence of events and historical people? Was there something that in the water? What was it at that moment that produced it?
I mean, this is a fascinating question. Yeah. Again, it's something that doesn't admit of any factual, right? I mean, this is an interpretive answer. Any answer I give to that is. I mean, I do think there were a lot of near misses. There's this fellow, Tony Bath, in England, for example, who had a Hyborian campaign, who had begun to run games, I think had a lot of that free-form improvisational structure to them around 1972, 73. I often say Don Featherstone is a sacred cow of the wargaming world. If there are any hardcore wargamers here, he ran Wargamers newsletter. He's someone you can't say a bad word about. His influence certainly checked Tony Bath. He thought all this fantasy stuff was nonsense. He didn't want to write fancy battle reports that were narrativized. He wanted everything to be very factual. It's just a game. Stick it to that. Had Don Featherstone not blocked Tony Batt, Tony Batt might have beat D&D to the punch. I also read a game about a family of games called Midgard that I think came very close. This actually came out of Germany originally, out of a game called Armageddon that was being run by a set of fans in science fiction and fantasy fans in Germany that was adapted by an Englishman into a play-by-mail game. I think it really failed ultimately because they tried to do it as a play-by-mail game. And it lacked that immediacy that we get from D&D. So, I look at it like there were a bunch of ingredients in the kitchen, and a lot of people were trying to prepare a dish with the same ingredients. And yes, D&D just hit on exactly the right recipe. So, is it inevitable? It's hard to say, but there was certainly enough similar experimentation that something like this would have come along eventually.
I want to ask you a little bit about your experience of D&D as a fan. I remember playing Dungeons & Dragons as a teenage boy, and in kind of just reminiscing and introspecting on that, so much of the pleasure of Dungeons & Dragons was in this collision, right? It was adolescence is a time of great anxiety. You're figuring out how the world works, and it seems to kind of work against you most of the time, especially if you're the kind of kid who's into Dungeons & Dragons. And there was such a deep draw to the idea that there was a logic underlying the operation of the world, not just a logic that determined how an arrow would fly through the air and hit a target or not, but then that same logic was maybe underneath whether someone would like you, whether someone would listen to you and believe you, the way you ordered drinks in a tavern, right? The way that you made friends and kept friends. And that, in thinking back on it, was so important. So I guess I want to ask you as a player of Dungeons & Dragons to share a little bit of your experience and whether that influenced your work as a historian.
Yeah, it's tough for me. I knew of D&D when I was a kid, but I wasn't really a player. I admired it from afar. It wasn't until after college, actually, when Magic the Gathering came out, I got really interested in Magic the Gathering, and that got me, after a circuitous path, back to D&D. So the D&D that I played then in the 90s was very, very serious D&D. The characters I played usually were very kind of dark foils of myself, I guess. So my experiences that were I'd say much more informed by games like the White Wolf family of games, like Vampire and games like that. Think about it, like I cut my teeth on that and went from that to D&D.
So what's the difference in texture between a White Wolf game and D&D?
Sure. Well, in classic D&D, again, if we had Mike Menard or someone who expostulates a lot about D&D in its very early days, it was a tactical game. It was a game where you did rely on the simulation to resolve all interactions the way that you're describing. There's room for innovation. There's room for acting, but you get the sense Gygax and Menard and those guys really kind of downplayed the theatrical element of it. They would write it up after the fact as a narrative. But Gary frequently would kind of complain about people who took the acting part too seriously. So I came into the LARPing community. I came into the part where it's all immersive, where it's all just you and I are going to have a conversation right now. And probably really doesn't matter what the system says. Right. This is, a social challenge we do in real life.
Interesting. So that was your
that's where I came in.
The more storytelling focused, the more character driven, theatrical, open ended, and yet your book you go so deeply and with such great fondness into the other side, the logic, the math, the systems.
I assure you, it is purely a bookish familiarity.
Huh. Wow. That's amazing.
I really had very little experience with war games as I wrote this. I played Chainmail once just for research as I wrote it.
Yeah.
I played Don't Give Up the Ship once.
But it's like so amazing. There are sections of this book. I'm just going to read you really briefly. Okay, so this is section 3.2.2.1. For those of you. No, but listen to this. This is beautiful. He's talking about avoidance and accuracy. So avoidance systems in war games are mechanisms in which a unit has a quantified probabilistic resistance to being hit. While most war games have some mechanism along these lines, it is best understood by contrasting it with systems where avoidance plays no part, where an attacker has an equal chance to hit any target in the game. A knight taking a pawn in chess can never miss, provided the move is legal. In Fletcher Pratt's naval wargame, when one warship fires on another, players estimate the range between the ships, and it is solely the accuracy of that estimate, rather than a die roll attempting to score within a range of probability, which determines whether or not a hit is scored. Thus, there is no concept of avoidance in that game. Though there is mitigation, as armor may deflect shells that have struck a ship, and there is endurance in that the quantified damage caused by a single shell hit is usually not sufficient to sink a vessel. Now,
You got all that, right?
Right. Like, here's the thing. Here's the thing. As a game designer and someone who loves this stuff, it's surprising how little of this kind of close reading there is of the develop. It's sort of like being a fan of music and for the first time picking up, someone who's talking about the history of instruments and of different scalar systems and of different styles of performance. And it's just great. The idea that this close reading of mechanics it's just, I love it.
But I think it's absolutely essential. Again,
Yeah.
I would have settled for nothing less. This was very determinedly what I went after. I wanted to be able to explain why these games have the structure they do. And these questions had answers, right? Like when I was talking about Rice Bits, I was really captivated by the idea. Somebody must have been the first person to pick up a die and say, okay, on a 1 or a 2, I hit. Who was it? Right? There has to be an answer to that.
Right.
And what you do is you go read everything until you're sure you have an answer.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then that stuff isn't even that bad. The stuff I had to do like that took a lot of work to sort through.
And it's beautiful, partly because you're showing how these things that are often opposed or seen as being opposed instead exist on a continuum, and that it's funny because I don't read a lot of history in general. Like, I'm not super familiar with historical writing as a mode, and so partly I think this is my sort of starting to understand the way that great historical writing also can illuminate the present, right? There's a sense, what's the famous book about the Middle Ages called The Mirror, the Dark Distant Mirror, right? And in which it's like, okay, here's this close reading of this historical period, but it's going to tell us something about ourselves. I feel like this is telling us something about the present moment, right? About the tension between, in current video games, between system and story, or between mechanic and expression, and I think it even is much broader than that, because I think we are living in this time. We have one foot in the virtual world, we have one foot in the digital world, and we have one foot in the real world. Half the time we're looking at our phone, and the other half the time we're looking over the breakfast table at our significant other or whatever. And we feel torn in these different ways, but here we see these things working together, coming together, existing as a continuum. I don't know, do you ever see the work you do kind of historically as reflecting on the present moment in this way?
It did better.
Yeah.
I understand a lot of people, use this book for design classes and things like that. And it is intended to kind of show the design space, and moreover to show how many of the design questions that come up in video games were questions people knew about in the 50s. Again, with the war gamers way before D&D, who were contributing to the War Game Digest, to Jack Scrooby's classic. It was really the first gaming zine that was published. In those 4 years that was active, they asked all of the interesting questions, I think. You can find articles that ask pretty much all of the interesting questions. I think we could say trite things about those who neglect history or doomed to repeat it or what have you, but I think people who neglect the sheer amount of design thinking that these people did, these amateurs did, before there was any notion that there could be an industry about this, or computers might take it over. People who were just from their sheer enthusiasm had to share these ideas with one another, put them out there for free, put them out there with no license, with no nothing, just have a fun game with this, do something with this. And it was that passion that carried through D&D and still carries through today to our indie games today. What I'm so heartened by is how much that indie game community has managed to survive just as games get bigger and bigger and bigger, as Call of Duty sells more and more and more copies.
Yeah.
The fringes are still just so rich and nasty and full of all the stuff I like.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I don't know, sometimes, so I'm a game designer, I teach game design, but sometimes, and listen, part of my job and part of this project, which I'm happy to be part of, is the professionalism of game design. It's like, oh, this is a thing you can devote your life to and earn a living at, and I'm proud of that, and I believe in that. But I also, there's an aspect that I miss. It's not that it doesn't exist anymore; it still exists. But I have a real admiration and kind of romantic fondness for game design by amateurs. That for game design done by people who are not professional game designers, who are enthusiasts, who are players, who are fans, who are mathematicians or inventors, and I think that that's something it's still here, right?
Well, and it's a permeable membrane as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, you start as an amateur, and then you make Minecraft, right? And the next thing you know, you're a billionaire, right? It's
Yeah. Was there so the development of the beginning of D&D kind of corresponds to the start of there being such a thing as a professional game designer, right? The board games were becoming an industry, or commercial board games were starting to be, was there much overlap? Was there tension there? Did they wake up and take notice? Was there, Milton Bradley, and, was there any overlap between those worlds?
Sure. I mean, one of the interesting things actually about when we look at the Avalon Hill board game culture, there was no cult of personality around those designers. I mean, they actually intentionally kind of suppressed who the people were that designed these classic games like Africa Core or Bulge, or these World War II simulation games that kids played in the 60s. Jim Dunnigan, actually here in New York at SPI, I think kind of changed that. Jim Dunnigan became a celebrity designer and dedicated a lot of his energy to promoting himself as a designer. I hope none of his familiars are here. Greg Costigan is here sometimes.
No.
Okay.
Sometimes comes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure I'm not going to get smacked what I say. But I mean, that I think by the time D&D came out, yes, you see Gygax and Arneson's names on the cover in ways that you don't on a lot of earlier games, right? You see the title of the game, but even in SPI's games, it would be pretty rare to see Dunnigan's name on it. Now, if you read Strategy and Tactics, which everyone did at the time, you would read what a great man he was from his innumerable sycophants who constantly wrote that he was a genius in like every column in the paper. But, it wasn't, I'd say D&D did play a large role in popularizing that. There was a name designer behind this.
Yeah. So along with this tension, right, between the theatrical and the systematic, between math and performance, there is this tension between kind of literature and system, right? So there is obviously there's this deep relationship between Tolkien and Dungeons and Dragons, and I guess my question is, how, is that also just a historical accident? Is it the fact that Tolkien had just come out and was a popular, author within this genre that overlapped so much with games and related fandoms, or is there something like I don't know? Let me see if I can boil this down. So there's a sense in which we. Dungeons and Dragons and role playing sometimes feels like it's burdened with genre fiction, right? It's shackled it's shackled to elves and trolls and these formulaic genre conventions that we would like to get away from. But is there a sense in which that is just revealing this deeper connection, right, between the systems, between formulae and story, right? There's for Dwarf Fortress, for example, which I didn't realize how much Dwarf Fortress started as a literary experiment. The Addams brothers wanted to see, can we write computer code that generates fantasy worlds, right? So it's sort of in the same way that Tolkien influenced Dungeons and Dragons, those forces go in both directions. So is there a deeper connection, right, that it's somehow the formulaic qualities of genre fiction are an important and essential aspect of how they work with role playing?
So I do argue that they are. Well, at least to the inception of role playing. in the sense of there's actually a long argument in Playing with the World about something called the visitation theme, about the fact that so many of these fantasy stories weren't in fact about just a fantastic world, but about the notion that someone from our world would visit it in this kind of serialized way. John Carter is a great example of this, where John Carter falls asleep and wakes up on Mars, but then eventually his time is over and he comes back, and then for the next installment he ends up going back again, and so on. And this obviously has a formal relationship to the structure of a session-based campaign game. And I don't think this is accidental. Narnia is another thing I'd cite for this. There's a whole list of these that I go through. Even Conan, actually, in some of the early Conan stories, has this quality. Now, Tolkien doesn't. Tolkien was a special case. And there's no doubt that Gygax very cynically wanted to play to the popularity of Tolkien to sell his fantasy rules, despite the fact that Tolkien was not his favorite fantasy author. And his writings about this at the time are full of pushback. Okay, he likes Thor at Oak and Shield, but there's so many parts of Tolkien's world he just finds dull. Wizards are completely ineffectual. He doesn't like the pacing of the story. It's not really an adventure story. I think The Hobbit is a lot closer to a D&D campaign than The Lord of the Rings is, right? And then in The Hobbit, really the story is about, let's go slay the dragon, get his treasure. He's literally in a dungeon. They call it dungeon there. Dungeons deep in caverns below, right? This is all built into the structure of the story. You got a party to do it. They split up their shares. You got a wizard, got a thief, got some fighters. Pretty D&D. Lord of the Rings, though, on the other hand, is really about having the moral forbearance to destroy a weapon, right? That it's really much more a story about people who want to avoid the kind of adventurous conflicts. I think a lot of Gary's pushback is really about that. Is nothing really exciting happens. It's really the Fritz Leiber, or Gore, right? I think when I wrote Playing with the World, I didn't know quite as much as I do now about some of the intermediate drafts of D&D. The amount that this Gore setting, people know Gore, John Newman's Gore. It's a very, today it would be absolutely unacceptable to make it. Well, I guess someone did actually this Kickstarter or something, a game based on Gore, right?
Not on Kickstarter.
Wasn't on Kickstarter?
No, sir.
We have a Kickstarter games guy here, so I'm sorry. Gore is a legendary misogynist, slavery-based setting, hugely popular in the Twin Cities, hugely popular with the Twin Cities crowd. This is a different time, different era, and it's hard for us in retrospect to get that in its proper perspective.
Yeah.
But Gore very much had the same kind of visitation structure, and I think these were profoundly influential in how they structured the overall narrative of the game.
It's funny. It's not just that it